All right. So hello, everyone. I'm Kira Nurieli. I'm the CEO of the Harmony Strategies Group, and Dr. Hector Escalante is with me. We're going to have a question and answer forum. We're going to ask each other questions and then have folks who are joining us ask questions and just engage in a conversation about what small and mid-sized organizations need to know about ombuds. What is the relationship between ombuds with small and mid-sized organizations? Okay. So as we get started, I don't know necessarily who's here and what your backgrounds are. So perhaps if you'd like to drop in the chat your location, your profession, if you want to share anything else about your background that could be interesting, what brought you here. I should mention that we are not set up in today's program for hearing or vision impaired individuals, but if there is anyone who would like a transcript or who would like a copy or any other accommodations for later processing the conversation, we can definitely provide that afterwards. Okay, so yeah, feel free to drop in the chat so that folks can get to know each other a little bit. Welcome. And while you're doing that, I just want to start from the get-go with thanking you for carving out some time for exploration and for engagement with each other. Maybe you're curious to learn a little bit, maybe you're excited to network a little bit, and whatever your intentions are, thank you for carving out time for that. And with that, I think we're going to dive in and introduce ourselves. So again, my name is Kira Nurieli, and I'm the CEO of Harmony Strategies Group. And for those who may not be familiar with what Harmony Strategies Group is, we're a somewhat unique collective of mediators and conflict management professionals. We help out with trainings, we help out with Ombuds Work, we also do private coaching, mediation, facilitation, all kinds of services and solutions depending on the audience. We help in educational spaces, we help out in professional connections. It really is, we provide an array of services and solutions, and we have a whole team. I think there's about 8 of us with a varied backgrounds and skill sets that we bring to bear to the work together. So that's about Harmony Strategies Group. And for me personally, my background is in organizational psychology. I have a master's in organizational psychology, and along with applied anthropology, I had started a PhD track in that. And I have certification in mediation, conflict coaching, and restorative justice, or talking circles. That's a little bit of my background, and I pulled together this group, this team, so that we can really build on each other's skills in Harmony Strategies Group. So I have my skill set and my background, and I share that with others. So with that, I'm going to pivot to Hector to share a little bit about himself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hector Escalante. Some people call me Heck. I am an organizational ombuds. I've been ombudsing at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California for 6 years, over 6 years now. My background is in education. I started out as a professor at the university, and lo and behold, here I am an ombuds. Not sure how it happened, but it happened. I have a few certifications here and there in mediation and negotiations. My doctorate is actually in organizational behavior and also in curriculum and instruction. So pretty much came from the academic sector. I used to work for the cable company. I can still hook up your cable for free, but I know that's illegal, so we won't do that. Let's see. I also have 4 kids, 3 dogs, and 1 wife. So that's a little bit about me.
That's beautiful. You shared a little more personal. I didn't share anything personal about myself. Now I feel like I should do a little of that to get a little more heart connection here. I'm also a mom. I have 5 kids, 1 husband, little personal stuff. And I'm calling in from Long Island, New York. So I'm also in denial that we're headed to the fall and cooler weather. So I'm wearing spring colors. So there you go. A little more personal there. Okay. So maybe we could start off, if you don't mind, Hector, I'm gonna start with asking you a key question, because I think that there are folks out there who aren't really clear just generally what ombudsing is about. Like, what is ombuds? It's maybe you can help just define what this role is.
Sure, sure. Do you mind turning off the share screen so we can see each other?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point.
So yeah, so that's a great question, Kira. I think just the word ombuds, originally it was ombudsman, right? It's a Swedish word. It translated literally means representative of the people. And in America, it's a fairly new concept. It's been around in Europe and it has roots all the way back to Egypt and possibly the Vikings of all things. So in short, I see the ombuds role as having two mandates. One is to serve people and the other is to serve an organization. When it comes to serving people, it's really about having a resource, a confidential, neutral, impartial, and independent resource for people to have conversations around workplace conflict. And a lot of what the ombuds role can do in that setting is provide psychological safety for people to raise issues that they might not bring to HR or to their supervisor for a variety of reasons, and nothing against HR or supervisors. But sometimes people just don't feel safe bringing up issues that they're dealing with and they don't know where to go. So the ombuds is a perfect place to go to address issues that otherwise might not fit, in a traditional type of formal role. And the ombuds works in dyads. I've worked with teams, I've worked with whole departments to work around conflict management, team dynamics, building trust, repairing relationships. So that's one big bucket, right? Serving people. The other one that I think is really important is to serve organizations. And a lot of times leaders don't understand, what the heck does an ombuds do anyway? Well, as an ombuds, I can help an organization by raising issues and having an ear to the ground that might otherwise go unnoticed, big issues that could turn into crises, right? So in one sense, the ombuds is like the canary in the mine. The ombuds often will hear trends that can be shared up to the organization. So in that sense, the ombuds is potentially a powerful change agent within an organization, within and also externally as contract ombuds. And one of the things I didn't share, and I'll stop talking here in a minute, Kira, is so I not only do I work as a university ombuds, but I also work with Harmony Strategies Group as a consultant, an ombuds consultant, serving some nonprofit organizations here and there. So.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So can you tell us a little bit more about, like, there's a lot of talk, especially through the pandemic, and a lot of, with the focus on social justice, like that employees are struggling often with a lot of stressors. Can you just maybe highlight a little bit of, like, how does an ombuds help with that then? Like, if the employees are just facing a lot or juggling a lot, what can an ombuds do?
Right. Well, as you all know, the last year and a half, almost 2 years, totally changed how we view life and how we work and even what we do. And one of the things as an ombuds that has really, the work of an ombuds for me has intersected with DEI work quite a bit. And in a lot of sense, the ombuds is advocating for fairness, right? So the typical saying is, I don't advocate for people, but I do advocate for fairness. And that can include diversity, equity, and inclusion. And often working with DEI leaders, and also not just DEI leaders, but HR leaders, organizational leaders. Often the ombuds role can partner with high-level people. As long as the leaders believe in the role and are committed to it, it's a beautiful partnership. Once a leader understands that an ombuds is their best friend, the ombuds becomes an incredible resource for people at the highest level, as well as any level of that organization. So yeah, it's been an interesting time for me. I'm a person of color, and I've always had a passion around DEI work. The last 2 years just accelerated that work for me. And so even who I report to, currently I report to the Vice President of DEI at our university. So that's a recent shift. So Yeah, there's a lot of transition, a lot of things happening in the ombuds world, but it's exciting. It's an exciting time.
Nice, nice. Okay, and so at worst case scenario, how would an ombuds help avoid crises then?
Right, and I think that's a really important question, because one of the reasons organizations hire an ombuds is because they've been blindsided by issues that went unnoticed until it was a crisis. And had there been an ombuds in place, that crisis may have been averted. And it's hard to measure, right? Like, I don't know how many lawsuits I've avoided or helped an institution avoid, but I know I have. And that's a key role of the ombuds, is to help an organization by being there, kind of as a stopgap, as that fire alarm, to say, hey, this is something you should take into account, because this could escalate real quickly. And I can't share a whole lot of examples, but I've had that happen quite a bit.
Yeah, thanks. So, boosting employee morale, and then of course, worst case scenario, really maybe avoiding crises. Sounds like you've had some robust experience with that, and I have as well. I mean, I just want to add to that from my experience, talking, especially one-on-one, when people come as visitors and they're talking with me one-on-one, they often have a different energy between how they come in to talk with me and when they leave. That when they first come to talk with the ombuds, you can tell that they're feeling very tense, very uptight, very fearful would be the right word, like really, really scared. And through processing with them, I think they come away with just a little bit more confidence to handle what they're facing. And the handling can look very different depending on the situation, but that confidence can help them so they don't necessarily run, let's say, right to litigation or right to an investigation, right? That they might consider what else they might do that can be like a softer landing for everyone. Because I don't think most employees want to make a beeline to their attorney, right? That's costly for them too. But if they don't feel like there's any other neutral, like outside independent resource, then they may feel like that's the only place they can go.
Right. And something I didn't mention earlier, but I think it relates to this, is many organizational ombuds abide by the standards of practice, the IOA standards of practice. And I happen to be on the board this year, and I know, Kira, you're involved with IOA quite a bit. And the piece that I think fits into this conversation is confidentiality. And that is that because of confidentiality, there's a place for people to go that they might not ever go to anybody else. And if we can assure people that it's safe to talk to the ombuds, and that anonymity will be promised, that people will bring issues. Title IX issues is a great example. And unfortunately, sometimes really bad things happen in organizations before they hire an ombuds. I will say, though, that there is an uptick in interest. That I've seen nonprofit, small, mid-sized organizations, universities are very interested in this role now, because it does dovetail really nicely into DEI work and also crisis aversion. And to your question earlier about who do you work with and who do you partner with, risk management. I'm one of their best friends, because they are constantly looking for risk, audit, compliance. So even though the ombuds is informal, often I find myself working parallel with formal entities to help individuals and the organization. So Kira, I have a question for you. So your background is in organizational psychology, which I think is fascinating, psychology in general. How does an ombuds help leaders, speaking of leaders, in the organizational structure?
Well, so there's a few ways that ombuds help leaders. First of all, leaders, just because they're a leader or manager doesn't mean that they have all the skills and all the resources to handle all the conflicts that may come across their desk, right? It's possible that their team is sort of breaking down and they're facing a team that's not trusting each other, and they don't know what to do. So I tell people that as ombuds, we can help both proactively as well as reactively. So what does that mean? It means proactively, we can help prevent, like I said, a crisis from, we can be a resource for some tips and skills as to how to handle things so they don't necessarily get, into an explosive space. And we can help reactively. So let's say something has exploded, how can people again find some sort of softer landing or the softest possible landing? Right? Because it may not be the one that is the first thing that comes to mind. So even with the most senior leaders, it's possible that processing what they're facing and what they're thinking with the ombuds can be really helpful. I mean, I've had, CEO turn to me and be struggling with like, gosh, we have this new initiative. I know I got to roll this out, but I am I am really concerned that it is going to go south very quickly because of X, Y, or Z. And, processing with him, what may go south, why it may go south, and then thinking through strategically, what are some ways to mitigate that? He actually came up with some really cool ideas, which it wasn't because I gave him the solutions. That's another thing, right, to point out is that we don't necessarily come in, we're not like the superhero to call that's going to just like clean up the mess. It's not that. It's that we help people do their best thinking so that they can find the solutions that they intuitively will be able to choose will work best. Right. Because again, they usually have a story in their head of like, I must do A and then B and then C, and not realize maybe there are alternative paths. And typically, very often, I find that especially leaders, once they process through and consider with me, what are some different options or who else might be a resource to help them, they come up with some creative ideas. And that's beautiful, because the more creative and innovative the leaders can be, the more that really sets a tone for everyone throughout the organization.
I think that's a great distinction, that the ombuds isn't necessarily tasked to fix the problem. I know my first year, I was working with a team, and the manager, I think she was a director, said, Hector, you're the problem solver at the university. And I had to say, I appreciate that compliment, but I'm not really the problem solver, because really we're exploring options, right? And helping leaders and individuals, employees to think about what they can and can't do, what they thought about doing already, and maybe point out pitfalls, right? Banana peels that they're not seeing, that are pretty clear to us. So just a quick follow-up, Kira. So does the ombuds mostly serve leaders or employees or both? Or we've been talking a lot about leaders.
Yeah, I think that depends on the organization and what they're facing. Because some organizations, and I've got 2 clients that I'm currently working with, and it's a very different culture within each of those organizations. So in one organization, I'm helping much more with the I'll call it, let's say, lower level employees, right? That it's not as many senior leaders who've been turning to me for help, and they're just in their culture, the senior folks are pretty much moving like a well-oiled machine. They pretty much have open communication with each other, they check in with each other, and they respect each other. At my other organization, I'm working more at the senior level, because they've been going through a lot with COVID, a lot of stress, and that extra level of stress and layer of stress can create all kinds of dynamics that are just not ideal. And if those dynamics are starting at the senior level, they will trickle down throughout an organization. So sometimes greasing the wheels with the communication dynamics from the top can be really, really helpful. So yeah, and so to your point, it's interesting. I actually had someone come to me and said, so you don't solve all problems for us, and you're not a therapist, and you're not HR. So like, what do you do? Right.
Right.
And I think, my answer was, it's sort of a combination of an organization's coach like the organization's coach rather than, you know, people go to a life coach or executive coach. So this is like the organization's coach or consultant, if you will, and just embedded or dedicated conflict management resource so that to just help people with like, again, an easy, quick resource to process through what's going on. And so, you know, greasing the wheels, I think, is a lot of what I do too, is, you know, when people, again, when you're feeling stressed, you're going to be tightening up and you're not necessarily feeling like a smooth interaction, smooth dynamic with others. And just from a neuroscience perspective, we know that when people feel that stress, they're not doing their best thinking. Right, they're focusing much more on their limbic system is like hijacking all of their thoughts and energies. And what we do is sort of slow down, use those standards of practice, the confidentiality, neutrality, independence, and informality. We, you know, because we have those standards of practice, we create like a safe space for people to feel comfortable, and we sort of set that tone to just slow down, kind of decompress. And then once you're getting that oxygen, once you're getting that air, once you're letting your blood flow in a way that's healthier, then you can access your higher thinking. So we sort of just help with that, you know, again, greasing those wheels, slowing down these processes so that the best possible solution just kind of can come forward.
You know, just by you describing that, I can feel my heart rate slowing down. I feel calmer already, just by the way you express that. That's beautiful. Yeah, and you know, the only thing I'd add to that, Kira, is that it really depends on the leader. So I won't share a whole lot, but I've had experiences with leaders who really believed in the role and others who didn't. And it made all the difference in the world as far as how effective I could be. Because, you know, one of the things I think that happens is, I'll put it this way, a good leader wants to hear bad news. They want to know what's going on, that they're not hearing. And often the ombuds is the person who's hearing it. A leader who doesn't want to hear bad news makes it really difficult to be an ombuds. Because if that leader doesn't want to hear bad news, then where does the ombuds go, right? The ombuds has to find another way to surface and to bring that information up, which, and that's a whole other conversation about how you do that. But just to your point, you know, a leader needs to understand what the role really does and what it means and how it can help. So
yeah. So unfortunately, for those of us who like to be like the peacemakers, we sometimes are in the role of those who are the bearers of bad news, right? We're the ones who are bringing the conflict to the surface. We're like, excuse me, knock on your door, Miss CEO. Right. I have to tell you that you know, there's something coming down the pike, right? So or something that, you know, you may want to focus your attentions here or your attentions there. But to that point also, you know, we're also not advocates of anything in particular, right, Hector? So we're not necessarily taking what a visitor says and then just like driving it ahead per se. Maybe you can tell us a little more about how you then handle that. Like, so if you're not necessarily advocating for one person's perspective, you know, how do you navigate what you do?
So are you saying once there's a trend or once there's something that I feel needs to be raised?
Yeah.
Yeah, so so for example, it depends on what it is that's coming to the surface. It doesn't necessarily have to go to the highest level. It doesn't have to go to the CEO or the president if that's not where, you know, the solution probably lies. So it just depends on where something is happening. You know, that sometimes people will ask me, well, how many people do you need to hear from before it's a trend? And it really depends, right? It could be one person. If it's a serious enough issue, I'm going to raise it. And normally I go to where I think the problem lies and which leader owns it. And if it's at the highest level, it's the highest level. If it's an AVP, I go to the AVP. If it's a director, I go to the director. One of the things I get early on, I started getting a lot of complaints about bully bosses or bosses that were just uncivil or abrasive. And the hardest thing to me was to go to that boss and say, hey, you know, this is how you're landing with folks, because that's where it was living, right? It wasn't necessarily the person above them. And I obviously had to get permission from my visitor first. So, you know, the ombuds role can get pretty complicated. It's a unique role. I think it's the best job I've ever had. If you're considering being an ombuds, I know some of you are ombuds in the audience, and it puts all my skill set to work. And the other thing I'll say too, I know it's a little bit off your question, but it also takes a lot of courage, I think, to be an ombuds, because sometimes you have to speak to power and they might not want to hear what you have to say. But that's part of our job, right? So to answer your question, it really depends on what the problem is, where it lives, that determines my next steps.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sure, absolutely. So, you know, since you mentioned the interaction that you might have with a director or, you know, with somebody else who's in, you know, a leadership role, can you tell me a little bit more about how you navigate also how or how you're different in your role and what your relationship is like with, let's say, HR or DEI or even like the
Sure.
COO, you know, at an organization?
Right. Yeah. So the biggest distinction is the ombuds is informal, right? So there are formal entities within any organization, and they have to function within their policies and procedures. As an ombuds, because the ombuds ideally is an informal entity, it allows that space, right? Like we've been talking about psychological safety. So for example, I work with HR quite a bit, and often it's employee relations issues, and sometimes they'll come to me before they go to HR. And I don't know where you work, but HR tends to have different types of reputations, let's put it that way. And there are great folks in HR, nothing against HR, but often a person will come to me and I'm hearing their story, right? And I'm trying to listen to what's really going on with them, getting to the root of why they're talking to me. And I'm thinking, you know, they really should be talking to HR. They want someone to look at their job description, or they feel like they need, you know, to be paid for work that's outside of what they normally do. Well, you know, now it's my job to say, okay, you know, let's talk about some possible solutions. Have you considered talking to HR? Oh, no, I don't trust HR. You know, that they're out of retaliation, there's too risky. And then we'll talk about that. Tell me a little bit about that. You know, open-ended questions. Ombuds are really good about asking the right questions and getting to the heart of the issue. And once we talk about, okay, what's the real risk of talking to HR, then we can talk about, well, would you like me to go to HR and just find out what normally would happen? And so I'm kind of nudging them that way. I've even had them in my office here and say, I know the director of HR. Her name is Linda. Let's call her. I'll tell her that there's a visitor in my office, but I won't tell her who you are. Is that okay? And we'll ask her questions. So, I mean, you start to get creative, right, about how you help people get to the right place. So those partnerships are really important, and they build on your reputation, right, as an ombuds. People will start to recognize Hector's here to help, Joan's here to help. They're not here to compete with HR, right? They're here to partner with me. And once you kind of tip that scale with these formal entities, ombudsing gets a lot easier because you're building trust, basically. You're right. So now your leaders know that you're not competing with them. You're not trying to, you know, throw them under the bus, go to the media and report something, which has happened. And that partnership, just as that builds, what I found over 6 years is that the stronger those relationships are across the organization, the easier it is to do your job as an ombuds.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me, what would be the ideal, you know, we're talking about in small and mid-sized organizations, right, where these are a little bit more intimate communities. What would you say is the ideal relationship with an ombuds? Like how would a CEO or, you know, head of HR or head of operations, head of finance, like how would they relate to the ombuds? What do you think?
Well, that's a really good question. One of the struggles with ombudsing, especially if you're internal, is independence. So it's somewhat of a paradox, right? How can you be independent and be an employee? and often faculty will ask me, Hector, who do you report to anyway? I used to report to the president. I've reported to the provost. I've reported to the chief of staff. And they want to know that because that's that formal connection, right, to the organization. Learn to maneuver that. And those of you who've ombudsed in universities know that it's possible. The consultant contract ombuds is truly independent. And that is a benefit in and of itself. So I think that's a huge difference because you're truly like, one of my clients is Earth Justice. So when an Earth Justice employee calls me, they're not talking to Earth Justice, right? They're not talking to anybody that has a formal connection to Earth Justice. Yeah, they pay me, but I'm not an employee. I'm an external consultant. And that creates that separation that just adds another layer of confidentiality and impartiality and psychological safety. That term I keep throwing out there. It's probably an overused term now, but it's super important. So I think that's the biggest difference. Ombudsing, I don't think it's a whole lot different depending on where you are. I mean, the work is the work, right? You serve individuals, you serve the organization. The difference is when you're external and serving, a smaller entity that might not be able to afford a full-time ombuds, you have that separation. Your email is separate, your phone number is separate. Just that relationship with the organization is truly independent. So I think that's one of the biggest differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to share something that can be also something that, as an external consultant ombuds, something that is also important is that, ideally the senior leaders, would look at the ombuds as someone who's there to help, right? This isn't an outside consultant who's here to, just give you bad news, drop the bomb and leave, right? That this is a resource who's here to help everybody do their best work. That's sort of one of my mantras. I tell people, insofar as I have a bias, it's that everyone be able to do their best work and to be able to have a meaningful day, at work, right? That's my agenda, so to speak, is that, we have a fair environment, we're respectful of each other so that everyone can do their best work. At the end of the day, especially in a small and mid-sized organization. And that's what's crucial. A small and mid-sized organization, if a few people are coming into work and hating it, that really makes a difference, right? These are small companies where every voice matters. Everybody's input, everyone's productivity is super important. So, to my mind, an ombuds is ironically more of a vital role or service the smaller the organization is, right? Because, any one person not being productive, calling out from work, not being able to show up, not really wanting to interact with their team, not being able to feel, a relationship of trust with their peers, with their colleagues, they're like hiding information from them. Well, that's just a company that's going to go down, pretty easily, right? Because any one of those employees has a massive impact. So ironically, ombuds are typically embedded as a full-time role in larger institutions. But the flip side of that is any one person, any one visitor doesn't have as loud a voice necessarily, as loud of an impact at those institutions, at those organizations. Whereas in the small organization, wow, that can have like a big effect. So sure. Any individual visitor who comes to us, from a smaller organization, that visitor who's feeling like disengaged, not feeling like they belong, feeling like, there's a lot of tension or even bullying, like they're checked out, that's going to affect their work. That's going to affect everybody, right?
Right, and it affects retention. It's expensive to lose employees and replace employees. And especially right now, y'all are hearing about the Great Resignation, right? People have options, they're leaving in droves. And it's the good people that are leaving, that are just, that haven't been happy at work for a while, and now there are options, right? So we're seeing that at UOP quite a bit. So Kira, it's like 10:34 my time. I'm wondering, should we open it up for questions, or do you want to What do you want to do at this point?
Yeah, I think that would be nice. I think I saw some questions in the chats, although I'm in it, I'm focusing on the conversation, but yeah, let's open it up. Does anybody want to take yourself off mute and dive right in? Or if you did drop a question in the chat, you're welcome to, chime in about it. Or if I missed it, maybe Hector, you can help refresh.
Yeah,
there.
well, Angela asked a really good question. Should there be different ombuds for students and faculty and staff, assuming that it's feasible? And I think there should be a separation. I have several, being in the ombuds world, it's not that big of a community. Several university ombuds that are also colleagues and friends, the UC system in California, they have a faculty ombuds, a student ombuds, and an employee ombuds. I am a faculty, staff, and student employee ombuds because Pacific's not a large university. I don't serve students. I wish we had a student ombuds, I really do. So it really depends on the organization, but if you can, that's ideal because each constituent has different needs.
Yeah, I want to add to that also that one of the things that's somewhat unique about Harmony Strategies Group is that any one of our clients, so to speak, can have different people from our team serve different roles. So for example, I've got one client where I'm ombuds and they asked for some trainings. And while I can lead trainings, I thought it may make sense to sort of shift the energy a little bit and have other members of the Harmony Strategies Group team come in to lead those trainings. Because I think, again, there's like different skill sets, there's different strengths. So that's one thing that comes to mind. If we're talking about like a very small college or university, and you want to have ombuds for different, let's say, the students versus the faculty, or even beyond, but you don't necessarily have room for like a full-time role in each, that's a conversation that you could have with someone like Harmony Strategies Group, where we might be able to service all those different populations, with one contract, but with different people servicing the different entities. Does that make sense?
Right.
Yeah.
Looks like Diana has a question.
Yeah, go for it, Diana. Nice to see you.
Yes, thanks. Nice to see you, and thanks to you for organizing this. So I am really interested about your experience because I work in Europe, and we really struggle to provide external ombud service for small and middle organizations because first they don't have money and they really don't see the beneficial of the informal process. So what is the key points how you can sell for the small organization as an ombud services? So how you can, what is the selling point, if I may ask this question?
Sure. Well, I think,
or the point.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's important is to do a cost benefit analysis and to be able to speak to, well, what is the cost, right? And like Hector mentioned, turnover rates, right? It's possible that organizations are seeing people, it's like a revolving door. And by the way, that could even be a reputation. Some organizations get a reputation for being a revolving door, and they're not even going to get quality applicants because everything's on social media nowadays. As soon as you get some bad PR and people are knowing that, hey, you know what? Nobody's staying at that place, at that organization. Well, that sets things in motion so that you're gonna be really stuck with maximizing your bottom line. So that's really where an ombuds can help is, especially I can say if you either have that reputation or if you're concerned about that reputation, right? Because again, a few bad tweets on social media, and especially a small company, a small organization who's just getting their name out there, wow, that can do a lot for your branding. So to my mind, again, for a small or mid-sized organization, it's really about helping them understand what's at risk if they don't have an ombuds there. And, it's up to them if they then want to set up a contract with an ombuds or not. But having a fuller picture of, hey, it's not just like a nice thing, but it actually can help mitigate those crises and that bad PR, right? That, that can speak a lot. I mean, you can even talk with them about like, what in dollars and cents do they spend every time they do employee orientation, right? Every time they, need to say goodbye to one person and onboard another, how many months of work are lost? Because then you can calculate, well, so you're losing this many months of work. If you had an ombuds, you can't necessarily guarantee that you won't have any turnover right afterwards. But, we do know, those of us who, you're an ombuds, you know this, there are people who come to us who are about ready to turn in the towel, right? Some people do anyway, because it's just not a fit. But there are people who feel like, oh my goodness, thank you. I'm so glad this organization decided to have the ombuds. We finally have a resource to turn to. They're so grateful. And by the way, that also sends such a great message from senior leadership. If they establish an ombuds office, even if people are not necessarily running to visit the ombuds, there is a sense of like, wow, leadership really cares. Oh my goodness, I had no idea they really cared if we don't, aren't happy, or if there's tension, among our teams. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Diana. And my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Hedin, is on the call with us. He's a researcher and an ombuds. And I would just echo what you're saying, to provide data, provide information that a leader can look at and say, okay, here's the ROI. This is why the return on my investment is worth having an ombuds. And often that's missed. And it's actually one of the things that ombuds tend not to do, is to tell the story of their value in an organization, because at first glance, an ombuds might look like just an intake for complaints, right? People just come to complain to the ombuds, but the ombuds is way more than that, right? It's an opportunity for an organization to provide a resource, like you're saying, Kira, that would really, really help morale, climate, crisis, et cetera. So and that survey, there's a survey that goes out every year to ombuds that collects some of this data, right? What are the worst cases you deal with, et cetera, et cetera. So a little plug for our survey there, Tim. And I see your question, but I want to make sure we give Susanna Davis a chance.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So I am a little bit of an imposter here in this group, because I'm not in a small to mid-sized organization. I actually work in state government. But it is a small state, so it almost feels like a small organization. And I've been thinking a lot about the profession of being an ombuds. I'm looking very closely at it. I sort of discovered by accident that I think it's what I'm actually good at in life. And so thinking of it for future career moves. But I suppose my question, you may not be able to answer just because of scale, but I'm wondering, what can we do in organizations that maybe have, you have an HR, you have a human rights commission, you have an ethics commission. How do you demonstrate the need for an ombuds or an organizational ombuds type of role, where there may be similar but not quite well-fitting swim lanes that already exist?
So I think that it's important to underscore how the ombuds role is different from others. So Hector mentioned earlier the standards of practice that the International Ombudsman Association, or International Ombuds Association, they changed the title, what they have developed as the standards of practice. And these are really unique, and they create a very different dynamic with for people and to serve the organization. It really is much more of like an embedded consultant to the organization as an entity, in a way that none of the other roles has that sort of consultant kind of a flair. Right. And that's why I brought up this idea of like having an agenda, right? A lot of other roles have a specific agenda, like they are beholden to the organization to fulfill X, Y, or Z. And the ombuds doesn't, right? Aside from a general idea of fairness, we don't have a particular, lens through which we're looking, at a particular complainant, let's say, or a particular dynamic. We're very open to exploring a whole bunch of different approaches, perspectives on the situation in a way that, you know, there's no other role that really fits that. And so, you know, does it require a little bit of forward thinking mindset on the part of senior leadership? Sure. You know, ombuds is still a somewhat innovative idea in a lot of certainly business contexts, but even within government or university where there are ombuds in many agencies already or institutions already, it's still considered, it's still a little bit of an enigma. It's still a little bit opaque for folks to understand, like, well, how does this fit in? So yeah, oftentimes we have to explain. And that's why we wanted to have this Q&A, for example, you know, like, let's just put it out there. Let's explain to people, like, how do we help? Like, what does this actually do? How does it fit the current landscape? You know, how can we help? Right? What do we do differently, to your point? And so I think that it just requires having the ear of some senior folks at the top to be able to explain how this is different. And I will say that IOA, the International Ombuds Association, does do a good bit of outreach. And if there are organizations who are considering an ombuds, but just aren't sure, there's a lot of helpful material that they have on the website. So you could check that out if that's, you know, helpful for you. And then you can share those links with others. I mean, there is information out there about how an ombuds helps. But, you know, again, it's very different to read something on a link versus have, you know, a healthy interaction with someone who can explain it and address, you know, whoever the senior leader is, you know, address their specific questions about how the ombuds would help them in particular. Because like I said, there's different cultures also at different agencies, different institutions. So, you know, it's possible that this senior leader is looking for X and that senior leader is looking for Y, but the ombuds could still be a help in either scenario. Does that make sense? I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. It does.
Yeah.
So I would add, you know, it begs the question, right? Why would I want to hire an ombuds? Why should I hire an ombuds? What good is it going to do my organization, my, you know, agency? And again, it comes down to a clear understanding of what the ombuds does and doesn't do. And the clearer that is to you and to whomever is interested in ombuds, the easier it is to decide, okay, this does fit into my organization, because I think there is a lot of confusion around what an ombuds does. And the word itself is confusing, right? People call it ombuds, ombudsman, ombudspersons, omburg. I mean, they're just crazy what people, I hate it when they say ombuds, you know, it's ombuds. And part of that is because of the word. So there's just the innate confusion about, and it's so unique within organizations. But once, like Chuck Howard's book, great book, I would strongly suggest that you look at it, and there's tons of resources out there. So just like in any other topic, if you do the work and get clarity on what it does, and hopefully this session is helping, the easier it is to say, okay, yeah, I'm going to pitch this to whomever because it can really help. I was going to say one other thing. Oh shoot, I just lost it, but it's a great question, and I think it comes up. It's part of the obligation of the ombuds themselves, right, to constantly be at the forefront of the organization, saying this is what I'm doing. And I think this speaks to your question, Tim. You know, how does a contract ombuds develop legitimacy or trust? I think it's a really great question. So I'll just speak from my own experience, and then Kira, maybe you can share yours. Is that you know, we're not a huge operation here, so a couple of clients that I've worked with, the trend is it's taken me 6 months to a year to gain that credibility, and it really depended on the organization, how and what was going on. But what I did is I went immediately on a roadshow and put myself out there. I started volunteering for stuff that maybe I shouldn't have volunteered for. So for example, one of the orgs I work with, they're BIPOC. They had a BIPOC committee that wanted to talk with their leadership team, but needed a mediator. And they asked me if I would do it. I was brand new. I said, yeah, I'll do it. And I was scared out of my mind because I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, but it put me out there and they saw who I was, they saw my skill set, and that trust began to build. And it was word of mouth, pretty much, reputation. And pretty soon I was getting calls like crazy just from those sessions. And there was a lot of good that was done. So it took a little bit of time, and part of it is just knowing how to market, right, and put yourself in those situations that might seem a little scary, but that can also be just high reward. I call them high risk, high reward, and you got to be willing to do that.
Yeah, and thank you, Hector. I think that's spot on, and I would just add that. Again, I think there's different cultures, and one way to build trust is just being sensitive to that and being aware of, really going in with an open heart, open mind, curiosity about how the culture works, how things run, who has reputations for what, and just being curious about all of that. And I would say also, it's so supremely important for an ombuds to act with integrity. So that's something where it may be hard for organizations to vet, who they really can trust as an ombuds. But I think over time, people see that when an ombuds is working from the heart, they're working authentically, they're being transparent. I'm very big on there's that confidentiality, but whatever is not confidential, which I'm very clear with the boundary of what's confidential, anything outside that confidentiality, my style is very transparent, because I want people to know, hey, I'm going to just give it out there. I'm going to be all out there with who I am, because then they'll just get a sense of, you had said earlier, Hector, psychological safety. Like they'll know what to expect. They'll have a sense of who I am. But it is also engaging with some level of humility too. There's a larger culture. There's a larger system. And we as ombuds are not the superhero swooping in to save them, right? That's not our job. We do also need that humility to understand, where do we fit in? And that can take time, just like Hector said, 6 months to a year, maybe even more, to figure out where do I stand and how do I best help, right? Not to push too much too soon to break everything down. That's not our job, but how to help enough to uplift in, a way that really will help folks, head in a more, let's say, productive or positive or, fair platform or atmosphere. I see Stuart has a hand up. Did you want to chime in with something, Stuart?
Yeah, thanks, Kira and Hector. So what if an employee comes to you and they're quite unhappy about something, but you perceive that this is more a personal thing for them rather than really an organizational thing? So how would you deal with that?
Well, I think that the personal and the professional, we as ombuds are much more open to noticing and working with how they inform each other, right? We're not robots. We don't have like the on switch and the off switch with what's personal, what's professional, emotionally. That's for sure, right? If we had a rough day at home, it's going to inform how we do, engage it at work that day and vice versa. So, my approach is the idea of an ombuds is to help people, again, do their best work, be able to engage at work. So if there's something that is overwhelming in their personal space, I might do a little bit of exploring what that is. It's possible that, I have had experience where that's where it starts to feel a little bit more like this is a mental health consideration. And so I might refer that person, not necessarily make the referral, but, ask if that person has considered, seeking mental health support, for example, and what that might look like. And sometimes I've said every time that I've brought it up, they've really appreciated just exploring that idea, considering that idea. But we can often work hand in hand with people who already have mental health counseling, because the mental health counseling works more with like the holistic like background, like the whole self and the history and what they're bringing to the table, and maybe even medication or what they need to do to get a sense of just general mental health balance. And what we do is much more strategic. We're much more about like particular dynamics and particular conversations that are going on and how to move those ahead. We do some processing of like what's going on to better understand, but we have a little bit more of a hint of like, again, the strategic and the moving ahead than, let's say, what's classically in, you know, in a therapy kind of dynamic. Hector, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, and I think that speaks to the impartiality of the ombuds role, understanding that whatever you're hearing from a person who's complaining about this or that, that there's also multiple truths happening. There's another side, right, to this complaint. And being careful not to go, oh, yeah, that's horrible, you know, that shouldn't be happening to you. And that might be true, but trying to maintain that impartiality. And often what I find in those kind of situations is that allowing a person to talk, listening with empathy and compassion, and then helping that person maybe reframe the problem, right? And I tend to use nonviolent communication or compassionate communication to get people to see, you know, what their feelings are and what their needs are. And once you get to a person to really identify, okay, this is really what I'm needing in this situation, I don't feel valued, I feel like I need value from my supervisor, then that opens up the conversation, right? Well, how do we explore that? Maybe it's not your boss. Maybe it's, you know, there's something else that you're needing that you're not getting in this job. Maybe it's not the right fit for you. You know, that kind of conversation often happens. A lot of conflict coaching, right? I use crucial conversations as a framework, nonviolent communication. I'm not a restorative justice expert, but Kira in Harmony, you know, has some really great resources there that often work in those kind of situations.
Yeah.
So we're like 4 minutes left. I'm curious if Joan or anybody else who's an ombuds, if they have any insights or anything to share. Not to put you on the spot, but I'm just curious. I know you've all been listening very, very politely, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts.
Yes. Yes, I have a couple of thoughts. I echo what you and Kara has been saying. It's very interesting that you bring up the embedded ombudsman opposed to the independent contract consultant ombudsman. I do ombudsman in a rehab nursing home facility, and I have to deal with the residents, and I have to deal with the staff and family members. So you have three groups of juggling different types of needs and wants or whatever. And my mediation experience has helped me tremendously with that. I mean, amazingly, just tremendously, to be able to isolate each group and what their needs are. I look at the ombudsman as being a resource, but also a facilitator to help people process.
Yeah,
that's the way I see it.
You know, I think I'm going to also put up this slide here. It could be helpful. Here we go. Let's see. I sort of put together a little bit of a summary of what at least I saw as, you know, the key role of the ombuds. I'm wondering, Joan, if this reflects what you were saying also. You know, that the organizational ombuds is like the dedicated conflict management expert, you know, confidential, independent, neutral, and informal, but then also is that conflict coach, consultant, and mediator, to your point, Joan. We help with feedback. We're an alert system to senior leadership, like we mentioned before, and also may provide other resources, right? So many ombuds provide trainings. I know we do, you know, trainings, we do that facilitation, like Hector mentioned. We can also do, you know, restorative circles or community circles. And all of that is to, you know, boost morale and prevent crises. Did anyone else also want to chime in about, you know, how you see your work as ombuds?
Kara, can I add something to that?
Absolutely, please, go for it.
I also value greatly being a professional as well as consistent, because the people that I deal with, they say, oh, she's really consistent, she's professional, and that builds on the trust.
Yes, absolutely. That acting with integrity, that consistency. Absolutely.
Exactly. Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I want to share one last slide because we are heading to top of the hour. And I just want to let folks know that we would love to continue the conversation. This is typically how I end any training or presentation I do, because we really do a lot of work as ombuds in the relationship realm, right? It's all about how people relate to each other, how they process, things together. And so, true to form with acting with integrity, we'd love to continue this conversation. We'd love to continue this, system of questions and answers together. If you have further questions, if you'd like to get in touch with myself or Hector or anybody else on the Harmony Strategies team, happy to make more introductions. This is how you can get in touch with us. We have a website, we've got phone number, email, and we are also on social media. I know some of you had seen some of our posts. Hector, do you want to add anything, any last words before we bid everyone adieu?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And this has been a great conversation. And yeah, definitely consider us a resource, someone to reach out to if you have more questions around ombudsing. Ciao.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thanks for joining today. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.